A heritage bilingual is a native speaker of a language spoken at home that is not the majority language of the society in which they grow up. For example, a child growing up in the United States, Canada, or the UK, whose home language is Spanish, Polish, Punjabi, Russian, you name it, would qualify as a heritage language bilingual.
Par exemple, un enfant qui grandit en Belgique ou en France dans une famille parlant l'arabe, le polonais, le norvégien, l'anglais, est un bilingue de langue d'héritage ou de patrimoine.
Zum Beispiel ist ein Kind, was in Deutschland mit Türkisch, Polnisch, Arabisch oder Italienisch aufwächst, ein bilingualer Herkunftssprecher.
例えば、ポルトガル語、中国語、英語を家庭内で話し、日本で育った子供は継承語バイリンガルであると言えます。
Por ejemplo, una niña o un niño que vive en Noruega, pero habla español en casa, sería considerado un hablante nativo de español como lengua de herencia.
Örneğin Türkiye'de büyüyen ve ana dili Rusça, Arapça, Farsça veya Almanca gibi bir dil olan bir çocuk, miras dili konuşan iki dilli biri olarak nitelendirilir.
That was a nice way to start with the video. I've never seen Jason so serious, with such a serious face. So yeah, welcome to the second HLS brainstorming session. And the topic for today is who is a heritage language speaker? Now, just to recap, the first HLS brainstorming session of this year was held in March. It was moderated by Sylvia, and the theme at that point was to find out ways to study heritage languages in comparison with baseline varieties, but also narrowly defined as the languages that or the varieties that are spoken in the homeland. And one of the points that was underscored in that meeting was that heritage languages seem to have a grammar or at least grow a grammar of their own, which can be either a simplified version or maybe more complicated or with more innovations. And they seem to acquire a distinct identity of their own. So taking it up from there, and in continuation of what we had discussed, but we did not really have real answers to those questions. What is a heritage language? Today we are going to talk more about who is a heritage language speaker. And from what I understand, there are two different aspects to this. And again, we can bring up both. One is, of course, the macro social linguistic aspect of thinking about how would heritage language speakers identify themselves. What are the factors? What are the sociological factors? Does the diaspora put pressure? Is it because it's considered to be cultural capital or linguistic capital that we identify ourselves as a heritage language speaker? Could it be that the negative or positive attitudes that you have in the surrounding environment, does that determine whether one identifies oneself as a heritage language speaker? The other aspect of it is, of course, the structural grammatical aspect, which is the heritage language speaker a native speaker of the language? Is of course the question of what a native speaker itself is a challenge, is a very challenging one, and how do we define linguistic proficiency, for instance, given that there is so much variability in the proficiency of heritage language speakers? Are heritage language speakers native speakers like monolingual speakers? So these have been questions that have been anyway, we find them in the existing literature. So today we have some very prominent linguists working on heritage languages. They're going to talk about their viewpoints first. That's the structure that Roberta was also talking about. We'll start with very brief presentations by our four speakers here. Ianthi, Jason, of course, that's the video that he has, or did he send a presentation also, Roberta? That was
no. He said that the video is fine, and he said we shouldn't even bother. But he has slides if you want them. But that's it. He's
okay.
Fine.
So we basically have three. We basically have three speakers here. If I'm not missing anyone here, right? And they will begin with very brief presentations of 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But of course, at any other point of time, I think it would be nice to have long presentations by then. So I haven't really thought about who's going to go first, but we could go alphabetically, or we could just invite whoever is ready and willing to present first. So who would like to go first? Should we go alphabetically? I mean, of course, I'm then going to take the letter of the name rather than the surname. So if I have my alphabets order right. Ianthi, would you like to start? Would you like to share? And then we can start. Yeah.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
And can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thank you very much. I think this is very exciting. It started off as a very informal invitation, but it turns out that there are quite a few people who are interested in this. Thank you, Roberta, and the whole team for organizing this. So these are some thoughts from my side on who a heritage language speaker is. So I just wanted to ask the question whether there is such a thing as heritage language acquisition. I assume that this is first language acquisition with the L1 being not the same as the majority language. And I think that's what Jason actually said in his video. And I would like us to consider the fact that usually infants from birth to age 2 or 3, they get language input mostly from the immediate family. So then the question is whether I don't see any reason why at this point we can talk about heritage language acquisition in terms of the context. But of course, if you look at the input from the perspective of the input, if the parents are first generation migrants, why should we refer to the process as heritage language acquisition for the child? We assume that they will have the language they grew up with in sort of at a good level without much variation there. If, of course, parents are second, third generation migrants, then they may speak a variety of the L1 because they've been bilingual for a long time, also from when they were children. So the question that arises there is which aspects of that first language that serves as input to the child are affected in the variety spoken. But from the child's perspective, from the learner's perspective, there is no heritage aspect in the process. The child is exposed to a language, whether it's a variety of the standard or not, the child is not aware of that. And the child is exposed to that and possibly a second L1 if it is a simultaneous bilingual, and that second L1 could be the majority language or another language. And in that case, the process is that of bilingual first language acquisition. Now, I take this issue of ages and, looking at the child rather than the heritage speaker as an adult, because I have invested a lot of time in looking at the timing hypothesis, which is we need to look at the phenomena that develop in monolingual first language acquisition at a particular order and in a particular time. And I don't have the time to go through all of them, but there is a distinction between very early, late, and very late phenomena. And I think the point that I would like to make here is that when we think about heritage language acquisition, we need to take into account at what point that heritage language is presented alongside another language, which is the majority language. And the reason for that is because the gradual process of language acquisition indicates a progression that is based on prerequisite settings. So an early phenomenon is early, not accidentally, but because it paves the ground for the later phenomena. So heritage speakers are early childhood bilinguals, and most of the research on childhood bilingualism has focused on the development of the second language. And in that context, we have been looking at age of onset effects of the second language and how it affects very early phenomena in acquisition. And then we look at L2 input and exposure. But when you look at heritage language acquisition, the development of the heritage language, the first language in child bilingualism, is expected to show very early and early phenomena should be mastered by heritage language children as well as by monolingual. So there shouldn't be a difference there. And late phenomena should develop gradually and be more sensitive to the diversity of input, quantity, and quality in this heritage language development. So what I would expect is that bilingual children should diverge in their heritage language performance on late phenomena depending on the quantity and quality of their input. So I think in order to answer the question of, who is a heritage speaker, maybe we should consider the question of who is not a heritage speaker. And I would like to make that distinction from the linguistic perspective. A child whose exposure to the first language is unilingual up to the ages of 5 or 6 and immigrates thereafter is not a heritage speaker in my view. So, for example, if a child moves to another country... But I thought that
if you talk to a professor earlier, you listen to it.
It's okay. Mute.
Somebody is talking.
ये गैर नंबर 1 से ले लो.
हाँ सप्ताह चलिएगा.
Hello, can you please mute your microphones? I don't know how to mute everyone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, a child who is 5 or 6 and moves to another country and is immersed into another language will become bilingual, provided the L1 is maintained, but this is not going to be, in my view, a heritage language speaker. Also, a child growing up in a highly linguistically diverse society like India, where multiple language development occurs within and across family, community, and school contexts, and where, crucially, an approach whereby languages are separated in their use is not followed, which is typical of the UK, for example, or the US. This is not a heritage language speaker. It's very hard to identify this child in that highly linguistically diverse environment as a speaker of 1 or 2 heritage languages. Also, I wouldn't assume that children growing up in Ireland, for example, and attending Irish schools where language revitalization is happening at the moment, also in Wales, I don't think these children are growing up to be heritage language speakers, because the heritage language from the social perspective, it is a heritage language. Irish is a heritage language in Ireland, and Welsh is a heritage language in Wales, and it could be a heritage language, but it's not, because obviously for these children it's a second language. So finally, what I wanted to say is something about cross-linguistic influence. Now, we all know that it happens, and it's inevitable, not only in heritage language bilingualism, but in bilingualism more generally. And that cross-linguistic influence is subject to input variation, for example, schooling, and we have plenty of evidence for that. But the questions I would like to address is whether this cross-linguistic influence affects linguistic representations as such, or whether it is a matter of parsing preferences and production preferences. And in this respect, I would like to just raise some, the awareness of that evidence that has come through from a study that I mentioned here, Turkish returnees from the US and Germany to Turkey, where there seems to be a reversal of whatever, heritage language effects you can find. And this is reminiscent of the reversal of L1 attrition in studies of returnees. So it seems that this type of evidence shows more that it's not a matter of linguistic representations in this case, but more a matter of parsing preferences and production. The second question is whether this reversal to the standard L1 behavior affects late phenomena only, so more complex, let's say, phenomena. And finally, the question I wanted to raise is that perhaps we need to look a bit further into morphological variation in non-standard varieties, including heritage language varieties. And perhaps it would be useful to distinguish between different types of inflectional morphology, for example, transitivity marking like voice morphology, as opposed to agreement and resumptive uses of inflectional morphology. And that's it from me.
Okay, thank you. So we will respond and share our opinions later on, unless there are some very urgent questions here, some clarifications that anyone wants to make. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speaker. I don't see any hands up. Right. Okay. So yeah, Maria Carmen, I think she was here, if I remember.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see everyone on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you want me to start sharing? Yeah.
Yeah.
If it works. Can you see my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I guess I'll get started. So today I'm going to reflect on the label heritage as applied to a heritage speaker. And I want to clarify this is a reflection from me jointly with Kate Bellamy and Brechtje van Os, who I think is in the audience. This is in the process of being finalized for special issue of IJB, International Journal of Bilingualism. So these are the reflections that we've been considering. So just to start with the point that can you hear me? Yeah, okay. That we will run through the whole presentation. A heritage speaker is someone whose multilingual profile we should describe and not merely label. So we are approaching this not as outsiders to heritage language research. We all have used the heritage label ourselves in our projects, in publications, even I was with Denise involved in, I think Denise is also in the audience, involved in a heritage linguistics lab in Leiden. So our aim is not to reject the label or to create controversy, but to ask what the label allows us to see and what it might prevent us from seeing and what information we need in order to use it kind of responsibly. So the question is, who is a heritage speaker? Sounds as though it should have a simple answer. But as soon as we look across the literature, and if you've heard all of Jason's presentations, it becomes clear that the answer depends on which part of the definition we prioritize, right? The family connection, childhood exposure, proficiency, dominance, community status, schooling, the sociolinguistic history of the language, and Ianthi also mentioned this. We are going to think about ways in which the label is useful, but only if it is treated as the beginning of the description and not as the end of the analysis. Our working definition is narrow. Here we can say by a heritage speaker, we usually mean an early bilingual who was exposed in childhood to a family, home, community, or minority language that is not a dominant societal language and who has some degree of competence in that language. The definition brings together elements from Valdez, for example, who emphasizes being to some degree bilingual, or Ben Mamoun, Montrul, and Polinsky, who emphasize early exposure and a shift to the societal language. Polinsky, who often frames the heritage language as the weaker first language. Pupis and Rothman, who argue also that simultaneous bilingualism also fall within the heritage speaker category. I don't know if you can hear an echo. I'm hearing an echo myself. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I think, Pritha, I think you need to mute yourself. Every time you unmute yourself, there's an echo. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, this definition does not settle the matter, right? So Otegi, for example, argued that the heritage speaker has sometimes been established as a type without clear criteria for distinguishing it from other bilingual types. Meisel noted that even apparently uncontroversial points regarding the definition vary. Skontrans and Mike Putnam also note that there's a lack of consensus about the object of study. Garcia raised the concern that the term heritage language in the US context gained ground as the term bilingual then was being displaced. And Susanne Alverse and Adbacus and Peter Masking also reminded us that many of the phenomena are actually language contact phenomena. So this is the situation. So we should also, I'm also asking, like Ianthi, who is not a heritage bilingual, right? Because we should have boundary conditions. But we know that someone, if we define heritage bilinguals narrowly, and not everyone with a family or emotional link to a language is a heritage speaker. So someone may have an Italian grandmother or feel a strong cultural attachment to Italian, but if they did not hear or use Italian in childhood and they begin learning it as an adult, that person is not a heritage speaker under this linguistic definition. They may be a heritage learner or a culturally connected learner, or perhaps a new speaker, depending on the context. And then in an adult classroom, a learner is not a heritage speaker simply because the language is connected to identity. And that is important because otherwise we collapse linguistic acquisition history into cultural affiliation. Also, a first-generation adult migrant is usually not the prototypical heritage speaker in this literature, especially if they remain dominant in the language acquired in the community of origin. And in many studies, first-generation speakers are used as a comparison group, although the comparison also has to be justified, as we know. So the most delicate point is perhaps the balance bilingual in a stable bilingual ecology, right? We do not want to say that such a person can never be called a heritage speaker, because some authors use the label quite broadly. But we do want to ask, what does heritage add in these situations? So if the speaker is simply a merely bilingual in a minority original language context, then the relevant variables may be dominance, exposure, literacy, schooling, prestige, network density, rather than just this fact that someone is a heritage speaker, right? And when it comes to definitions, we know that they disagree. This is a snapshot from table 1.1 in the Albers et al. Book. So we know that some definitions emphasize connection, ancestry, culture, family relevance, community membership. But if connection is enough, then the category can include people who are not bilingual speakers of the language as well. And definitions also differ on proficiency. Some definitions describe the heritage language as weaker or less fully developed. Other accounts make no assumptions about the outcome. And the consequence is that proficient can become either part of the definition or something to be explained. The definitions also differ on timing. Some assume the heritage language is acquired from birth and the majority language comes later, usually around schooling. Others include simultaneous bilinguals. That matters because a simultaneous bilingual, a child sequential bilingual, and a late child bilingual may not have the same language history. And the status of the language also differs. So some work is really about immigrant languages in diasporic settings. Other work spans the term to indigenous, colonial, regional, or co-official languages. And once we do that, we have to ask what the baseline is and whether the term heritage is adding anything over terms such as minority language bilingual or community bilingual. And then finally, the grammar question is perhaps also quite theoretically loaded, right? So if you speak of a heritage grammar, we need to know what makes the grammar heritage rather than bilingual or contact-induced, community-specific, or shaped by reduced input or literacy, right? So this discussion is really important, and I'm very glad we're having it. So what does the label give us? So we also want to be very fair and explicit about what we may want to keep the label heritage, or heritage speaker, heritage language. The label names a recognizable field. It has helped create journals, conferences, reading groups, discussion groups like this one, labs, and a shared conversation. And so this matters. It also is useful for pedagogical purposes. Heritage learners are often not like typical foreign language learners. They may have heard the language at home, may understand more than they produce, may have strong family or identity connections, and may need different curricular support, right? And the work by Valdez and Kagan and Dillon is especially relevant for this pedagogical motivation. And then it also can have social and political value because it foregrounds language maintenance, minoritization, intergenerational transmission, and the fact that speakers may have an effective relationship to the language that is not captured by the label L2. And yeah, the label points to like a cluster of phenomena, right? Early bilingualism, asymmetric input, a dominant shift, limited schooling or literacy in one language, and language contact. So we think these are important points to take into consideration. But at the same time, the label can hide comparability problems, right? If one study defines heritage speakers by ancestry, another by early exposure, another by weaker proficiency, and another by the status of the language, then we may think we are comparing the same population when we are not. Or the reverse can also happen. We may fail to compare populations that are actually comparable because one has been called heritage and the other has been called minority, original, or contact bilingual. And the label can also hide a deficit frame. If the comparison is a monolingual native speaker, then bilingual variation is easily interpreted as incompleteness. And this is what Ottegi critiques, right? And also Dominguez and colleagues, Dominguez, Hicks, and Slavakova, they also discuss problems with this terminology in this area. So, this is also linking to what Ianthi was mentioning about India. I wanted to make the same comparison with Africa, right? So much of the heritage language template assumes a relatively simple configuration: one home or minority language, one dominant societal language, and is equivalent in the dominant language. But that template is useful for many migrant language contexts, but it's not universal, because in many multilingual ecologies, including India or African contexts, children may grow up with several languages distributed across family, neighborhood, market, religion, schooling, media, regional mobility. So a language may be minoritized in one domain, but widely used in another, and there might be more than one societal language. So the language of schooling may not be the language of the home or the language of everyday peer interaction. And in such context, then categories like L1, L2, heritage language may impose a hierarchy that speakers themselves do not experience in that way. And this is why we argued for modeling multilingual ecologies beyond this L1, L2 binary. And perhaps we can think of work by South African linguists such as Makalela who foreground fluid and interdependent multilingual practices. So if community and contact effects are not simply background variables, they will be then central to the explanation, right? So I do a lot of work on code switching, and heritage speakers do a lot of code switching. So if code switching norms vary across communities, then we cannot assume that heritage, for example, heritage Spanish in one place is equivalent to heritage Spanish somewhere else. Even with Spanish-English bilingualism, communities such as State College, San Juan, El Paso, Belize, Puerto Rico, New Mexico can show different preferences and different conventionalized patterns. We have seen that there are differences with bilingual verb constructions across different Spanish-English communities, and this is what happens when we have contact, right? The community history, the density of bilingual networks, and local norms need to be described. This also connects us to earlier work by Carreira, showing that Spanish in Miami and Spanish in Birmingham, Alabama, do not have the same sociolinguistic conditions. So if we call both heritage Spanish, but we do not describe these conditions, we then risk treating this contact landscape as one category. So the key move is to shift the question from, is this a heritage speaker, to which multilingual ecology produced this profile? That does not eliminate the label, but it prevents the label from doing too much of the explanatory work. So we do not need to solve the whole terminology problem before doing research, I think, but we do need to report the dimensions that make the label interpretable. So first, linguistic biography and timing. When did exposure to each language begin? In what context? How did it change across the lifespan? Age of onset should be reported as a continuous variable whenever possible, rather than reduced to a cutoff point such as age 5 or 6. Proficiency and use, we should report measures for all relevant languages, not only the language labeled heritage. We should measure literacy, domains of use, when possible, language entropy, rather than assuming the societal language is dominant. and actually intact as well. And then the ecology, right? We should clarify whether the language is immigrant, regional, indigenous, colonial, co-official, post-colonial, minoritized, whether it's institutional supported, and we should describe the density of the community and the networks. And then the contact configuration. We should say which languages are in contact and what the local code switching norms, if we are interested in this, are. So yeah, heritage Spanish in contact with English is not automatically the same as Spanish in contact with Dutch or with Basque or with Quechua or with another language. And if we use a monolingual baseline, we need to justify why is it the right baseline, whether it exists for the community and what questions it answers. Yeah, so just to finish, we want to end by being very explicit about the answer to the question in the title and about the proposal that follows from it. So our working definition is that a heritage speaker is an early bilingual who had childhood exposure to a family, home, community, or minoritized language, and who has some degree of bilingual competence or a meaningful, receptive, or productive experience in that language. And this definition draws on recurring elements by others. But we also want to be clear that this definition does not do, right? It does not mean that ancestry alone is enough. It does not mean that language is necessarily weaker, that a speaker is incomplete, and that every minority language bilingual in every multilingual ecology is automatically best understood through the heritage label. And this is where the main issue lies. The label is useful, but it is perhaps a bit unstable. And across the literature, definition differs in whether they foreground all these different elements, whether it's ancestry, proficiency, age of onset, etc. And this is why authors such as Otegui, Contrast and Putnam, Dominguez and colleagues have raised concerns about what the label may obscure. So as we see it, the problem is not that the word heritage must be abandoned. We have used it ourselves, and it continues to do useful works. It names a field, it names pedagogical needs. And yeah, our practical solution is basically to report the dimensions that make the speaker profile interpretable, right? This is what we want to do. So to return to the question and just finishing, who is a heritage speaker? It's a useful starting category, but we need to describe it. And the real object of study is the multilingual profile, and that is what we should describe as precisely as possible. And I will stop here.
Okay, can you hear me? Because my laptop is acting up today. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So this was a very nice answer to what we have already heard about as part of the video, which where Jason was talking about a working definition, and that's something that we also kind of generally take and go ahead. So that was one that. And then describe. So that was a nice one. And also, I think MCarme and Ianthi both kind of started off by saying that we also need to understand who is not a heritage speaker to be able to answer better who is a heritage language speaker. So we seem to be making a common ground or preparing a common ground for the discussion ahead. But now we'll go on to Masha's presentation. Masha. You are muted. Hello, Masha, can you hear us? Can the others hear us? Any,
okay. Yeah, I think I got that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so now I have to figure out how to share. And then we should be okay. It doesn't allow me to share. Weird. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
but is it loading?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, it's
there.
coming.
Yes, we can.
It's come already. You don't see it,
Okay.
Pritha? Okay.
No,
Okay, can you hear?
I still can't see it.
Okay. So
And now
thank you
I
very
see.
much. Can you all hear and see me?
Mhm.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to thank everybody for organizing that. Thank Roberta and Pritha. I think it's a wonderful topic and a great discussion. And I have the advantage of going last because people have already said everything I wanted to say. So it's quite easy. And I, when I was listening to MCarme, I thought, well, this is precisely what we need. We start with a very broad definition, and then we follow up with all the extra dimensions. And what I particularly enjoyed in this presentation was the idea that we have all these additional factors we need to consider. And since a lot of work these days is experimental, it gives us a lot of pointers towards what we want to do when we run experiments on heritage speakers. So what I want to do is talk about something that allows us to recognize heritage speakers as a distinct group. In the 1960s, there was this famous case in the US Supreme Court where they were discussing a movie. And the public wanted to ban the movie because it was considered obscene. And so the Supreme Court was deciding whether they know what obscene is. And one of the Supreme Court judges said, I know it when I see it. And that's something that we can actually apply to heritage speakers. You know, there are so many dimensions, but we know it when we hear them. So there are three large categories that we recognize: homeland natives, and we already talked about the fact that homeland natives are very separate as a group compared to heritage speakers. And then heritage speakers who acquire the language from birth, but mostly in family or informal setting, and their dominance shifts to the societal language, usually around schooling age. And then there are L2 learners, and some of them may be quite good, but they're never as good as heritage speakers in some ways. And so the two big questions when we consider when we think about heritage speakers as a separate group are how they're different from other bilinguals. I think everybody agrees they are bilinguals, but the question is how they're different from other bilinguals. The other question which came up today and comes up in the literature now and then is whether or not they count as native speakers. And that's a difficult question because, as MCarme said, we don't always know what a native speaker is. So it might be, we might need a separate session to discuss that. So I'm going to set the second question aside, but look at the issue of whether heritage speakers are different from other bilinguals. And there we can look at two levels: societal bilingualism and individual level bilingualism. And again, I'm following on the steps of my colleagues because when we look at societal bilingualism, there is stable and transitional bilingualism. So stable bilingualism exists in India, in Switzerland. One could argue that Spanish Catalan bilingualism is stable. Transitional bilingualism is the situation in a society where bilingualism is just a way station on the road to language shift. So one language is going to go away. And that's where we often see heritage effects or contact effects. At the individual level, we see again a difference between stable bilinguals who are proficient in both languages and a relatively constant rate, actively using both with less of erosion, and unstable bilinguals when there is shifting dominance and competences in one language is actively changing because of altered patterns of input and use. That even includes the case of returnees, which Ianthi mentioned, because the dominance doesn't have to be stable over life. But the reason people have been kind of uncomfortable with the term heritage speakers, and there was all this discussion about whether they're native or not, is some discomfort with terminology. Before the term heritage speakers arose, they were called semi-speakers, shifting speakers, recessive bilinguals, and I put dots there because there are many other terms. But what I want to emphasize is that unstable doesn't mean any judgment, doesn't mean bad, it doesn't mean deficient, it doesn't mean incomplete. It's just a descriptive term about the trajectory, not a judgment about the speaker. And so one of the things that allows us to tell heritage speakers right away is what we can call heritage accent. That's something that hasn't been studied as extensively as the morphosyntactic and semantic domains, but that's something that we see in early bilinguals with shifting dominance, and something that people hear right away. So it takes me back to this Supreme Court Justice quote. We know it when we hear it. It's basically something that develops due to prolonged lack of exposure, reduced input, and that means that even when you have a bilingual, you have a lot of different varieties, and even in the sound system, you see how the use and amount of exposure plays a role. So recently there's been more and more work on heritage accent, and the idea of identifying the phonetic and phonological features that make heritage speakers audibly different from homeland speakers, from baseline speakers. So if you give some very small samples of heritage speaker recordings to naive baseline speakers or homeland speakers, they immediately sense something is off. And they often say it's not a second language learner, but this person wasn't born in this country, or this person is a heritage speaker. So it's hard for listeners to categorize these people, but they hear them as a separate group. If we look at the phonology at the level of categories, we see that the phonology is most preserved domain. But what we see is that there is a divergence in segmental and suprasegmental phonetic categories. We see that, for example, in a lot of work on VOT. So you have a chart on the screen which shows VOT in different immigrant groups for across generations. And so what I did an aggregate of this chart just to show you how you see a difference between a homeland monolingual and a second or third generation heritage speaker. We also see differences in vowel quality. Many years ago now, Linda Godson did a study of heritage Armenian, and she found a very systematic shift front in all the vowels of heritage Armenian, possibly under the influence of English, but the fact is that these speakers did sound different from. And there's one of the most telling parts is suprasegmental divergence, where naive listeners can identify heritage speech from prosody alone, and sometimes we see that segments are less diagnostic than the suprasegmental thing. So we see some rhythmic transfer, for example. There's work showing that stress-timed English rhythm is imported into Spanish or Italian. We see some intonational restructuring, particularly in focus marking, that's been shown in the work by Red Hood on Spanish. The work by Charles Chang shows that tone contours diverge, and again, we see a difference in tonal contours of Mandarin between heritage speakers and even very, very proficient L2 learners. These two groups are different. So this is where I go back to listener accent ratings. If we give people match guys samples of heritage baseline and homeland speakers, they always say that heritage speaker, they always identify heritage speakers, and they cannot quite place them. They're saying, you know, doesn't sound like an L2 learner, but doesn't sound like a native speaker. So the ambiguity is not just a measurement noise. It seems to reflect a genuinely special position that heritage speakers receive. And that's a very important sign that this group needs to be recognized and continue to be recognized. At the same time, as my colleagues have mentioned, we do need much more fine-grained approaches to this group. So what this group tells us is that we have a unique acquisition history where they have native early input, then they have dominance shift, and then there is a minority status in adulthood. No other speaker type has this profile. Heritage speakers technically meet the native definition, but they diverge from what we would call native in some L2-like ways. And that compels a lot of people to think of native speakers as a continuum. And looking at heritage accent or more generally at the sound and prosody of heritage languages, tells us what we get from early exposure and which things are more resilient and which things are not. In terms of real-world consequences, I think MCarme has already mentioned quite a few of them. I just want to identify a couple more. On the pedagogical level, there's been a lot of effort for to treat heritage speakers as relearners of their language. In the US context, we see a lot of them going to language classes at the college level, which might be a little too late, but what's important is that they need their own pedagogical approaches because they have native-like pronunciation and listening. At the same time, they have limited literacy, very narrow register range, gaps in formal vocabulary. And if they go to an L2 class, that's a waste of their time and that's a waste of their sound system. And in terms of social status and identity, a lot of these speakers are neither here nor there. And because they show these subtle phonetic divergences, in a native community or an ethnic community, that could be read as cultural slippage or lack of authenticity. And that places these people at risk in terms of their psychological pattern. So I want to close with this quote from the Supreme Court Justice I mentioned in the beginning. We see early evidence of heritage language. Speakers say, I know it when I hear it. And what we see is this heritage accent, which identifies these speakers. And then once we know what they have, we need to look at other properties, many of which MCarme has identified. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. I hope that the teams work. Can you guys see me and hear me?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's a very relevant point to take from Masha's presentation, that heritage accent is something of a indicator that heritage languages are different and heritage language speakers are different from other L2 or bilingual speakers. And, that's also, at some point, I will come back to this because I think Ianthi said in her presentation that Tamils in Delhi are not heritage speakers because these are huge, minorities who speak their own languages. And I think even MCarme talked about multilingualism in India. And heritage accent is definitely a parameter that one can take to identify whether intra-country migration actually leads to heritage language situations as well or not. But this was an interesting set of talks or discussions. We are now open for more observations and ideas from all the attendees. So anyone who has anything to say, please raise your hand. I don't see all the participants on the same screen, so I might have to move around. But if you raise your hand, I'll be able to check out and yeah. Natalia?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you all for this wonderful presentation. So happy to see you all and for these rich presentations. And I do want to connect the three presentations that were given today. For example, we have been looking in Israel for a long period of time into Russian as a heritage language, and we did see the profile where indeed Russian is a weaker language and there is a shift towards the societal language. But we are also looking into heritage English, and the definition, if we look at it, is a minority language in the Israeli context. Bilingual speakers acquire it from an early age, but these speakers show a very different profile. They are almost balanced bilinguals, and we don't see this shift towards the societal language with respect to their proficiency. When we ask them, they do feel that the heritage language is lower compared to the societal language. They would rate their abilities in the heritage language as lower. However, what Masha was saying about accentedness, Yes, they sound a little bit accented in the English, and native speakers, baseline speakers, native line speakers from the United States would notice that they were not born in the United States. Of course, for L2 speakers or for non-native English speakers like me, they sound very, very native. However, those who live in the United States of America would notice what Masha said, something off. And so yes, we hear people hear it, although their proficiency might be very, very high, and they would fit in all the categories mentioned by all the speakers, like early exposure to the two languages, minoritarized context, although it's very hard to say that English minoritarized in Israel or any corner of the world because of its lingua franca status, but people hear it, and we do when we run experimental studies and we ask naive people to listen to very short excerpts of their speech. So people living in the United States, they notice it. So kind of want to link to what Ianthi Tsimpli was talking about, early acquisition. So yes, phonetics and phonology are presumably acquired early, but even very early acquired phenomena might be also prone to divergence. So at the level of phonetics and phonology, and for example, in our case, we were trying to test this hypothesis with morphosyntax as well. And what we see with heritage speakers of Russian, which shift their dominance, we also see that early acquired phenomena are also prone to divergence. For example, case morphology, which is very early acquired in monolingual Russian-speaking children. So I think I kind of like the idea that we need to unify the field and to provide more data to document who the speakers are and how we document and how we measure their proficiency via what kind of tools, the context. The more information we provide, the more comparable the fields will be. And I think in the latest years, what is important that we are connecting child language acquisition and adult heritage language acquisition, and it is a very important step because I think in the last decade it is happening. Before that, these two kind of fields were using different terminology, but this time it allows us what, like Silvina Monturul was talking about, connecting the dots, and we can definitely discuss the trajectory of development. Maybe more longitudinal studies will be there when we're going to be getting more funds, and we will be able to follow people longitudinal for a longer period of time. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Christiana? You have to unmute
Thank you
yourself.
so much. Yeah, I think I managed to unmute myself. Thank you so much to all three speakers and to the organizers. I have a question which connects all three talks, or maybe also like individual questions concerning the individual talks, which can then be brought together. And then just as a background, I'm not from a heritage, from an approach to heritage languages or heritage speakers, which focuses on the heritage speaker against a native baseline. I'm from sociolinguistics, and so it's so interesting for me to see how the understanding of a heritage speaker that is common in sociolinguistics so strongly differs from, or it includes less variety, I would say sometimes. And so when I listened to the first talk by Ianthi, and then there was this sentence on one of the slides, who is not a heritage speaker, and who's not a heritage speaker is a child whose exposure to the L1 is unilingual up to the ages of 5 or 6 and immigrates then. And then in the research or literature that I rely on for some of my studies, you can even talk about 1.5 generation heritage speakers. And so my question is that how is your attitude toward that? It can be by an answer by Ianthi or all of you who think you might want to contribute. And then also, I was really captivated by the heritage accent concept, in that I'm not entirely sure that I understand how a heritage accent differs from just a non-native or otherwise not entirely, so to speak, in layman's terminology, not entirely fluent, phonology and prosody, etc. And then a last remark that I'll make is I was thinking, because for me, many of the cases where you pointed out, this is not maybe entirely a heritage speaker as we would define it or work with. My my suggestion draws a lot on the presentation by MCarme, which I also found very inspiring. And it's that if we look at every single speaker against the background of the broader multilingual ecology, then maybe even those speakers who are not by the book a heritage speaker, like 1.5 generation speakers, for example, maybe they too can count as heritage speakers depending on what kind of aspect we're looking at. And so while, for example, myself, I look less at acquisition and I look more at for example, factors impairing language maintenance across the generations, then maybe a 1.5 generation speaker still is a heritage speaker because of the heritage aspect, etc. So yes, it's several aspects that I'm touching upon, and I'd be happy to discuss a bit.
So would anyone like to answer now, or should we take all the questions and maybe there are other questions coming? Is that okay, Masha, Ianthi?
I haven't been taking notes though, so I may forget what the question is if we take all the questions.
So would you like to respond to Christiana's?
Yeah, I just want to say, well,
do it as a conversation. Otherwise, we
if
end
that's
without
okay.
time.
I mean, it's just because of my memory. So, so first of all, Natalia, thanks for your comments, particularly the ones that I could relate to because of my presentation. I just wanted to say that the open questions that I presented at the end, which had to do with cross-linguistic influence, I think cross-linguistic influence is everywhere, right? Whenever if you are bilingual, whether you are heritage or not, I mean, you're bound to show effects of one language on the other. And that would affect also, for example, morphosyntax, which is supposed to be quite early in development, right? But for me, the question is, to what extent this cross-linguistic influence is something stable? Okay, so how is it? Because the study I referred to with the returnees, which Masha made reference to as well, it's not just the shift of dominance. It seems that they are indistinguishable from, those native Turkish speakers who are monolingual in Turkey, right? So the morphosyntax of it actually seems to go back to normal. And I don't know whether this normal, I mean, the baseline, the standard baseline of the person who was growing up in Turkey. So I have to say that I'm very happy to accept that there is cross-linguistic influence that affects all sorts of different phenomena. But the question for me is, what does this show? I mean, what is it that is affected at that level? Is it the level of the representation, right? I still believe in representations, right? I don't think everything is, a construct which is out there. So that's my question. And I think with returnees, you can actually check that. You can see which phenomena, are affected. I haven't done this research myself, but I think it's very promising in this context. And just to say to Christiana, thank you for your question. Yes, I mean, the reason why I think that a child is not heritage speaker if they've migrated, at an age, I mean, older than 5 or 6 years, is because you have already had the chance to consolidate the L1 for the period of time where your morphosyntactic development is happening. And of course, there are phenomena that are acquired later, even in primary school years. I mean, that can go on up until the age of 10 or 11, and I do expect effects there. But this, to me, I mean, it's a question of definition. It wouldn't count as a heritage speaker. It just has to do with the amount of input that you have received during the formative years, as we say, for language development.
Yeah, Moshe.
Can I add a little bit, mostly responding to Christiana, about whether or not heritage accent is something special? I probably went too fast, and it is a fairly novel area, but from in all the studies where heritage speakers are compared to L2 speakers on sound basis, both in terms of perception by naive listeners and in terms of measurements, we see that people identify them as a separate group. You particularly see that in VOT. I showed you like a very small aggregate result from Toronto, from the Toronto group, because what they have is they have several generations, and that's very nice. But we also see that in tone studies. So the bottom line, without going into a lot of details, is that these speakers are neither baseline. So if we compare them to their input, to the language of their parents, they don't sound like their parents, and they don't sound like very, very good L2 learners. So for good L2 learners, they still need to do a little more work to approximate heritage speakers. So that places them as a separate group. And to me, that's a very strong indication that we want to continue identifying them as such. And if I may, just a very quick comment on Ianthi's presentation. I agree that we want to separate phenomena which are acquired early and late. But if we look at heritage speakers, we sometimes find that some late acquired phenomena are actually pretty robust. The one thing that comes to mind is islands. So there's work by primarily by Kim and Goodall on island effects in Korean. Islands are learned very late by children. We see English work on English primarily showing that we have very late island acquisition. Heritage speakers don't have any problems with islands. At the same time, they do show significant problems both in production and comprehension with such early things as agreement. Agreement is everywhere, and you take Romance or Slavic languages, and you're supposed to see agreement in Concord, and that's where heritage speakers fail from language to language to language. So to me, that's a big mystery. I was wondering if anyone would have comments on that. Thanks.
Okay, so
and I learned how to mute myself, so I'm very proud.
Okay, so we'll go on to Elena.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So hi, everyone. I have a feeling Ianthi has something to say directly to what Masha had suggested. I wanted to kind of throw in an extra comment. Hi, all. I go by Helen. My institutional name will not change. It doesn't matter. So I just a very brief comment. I want to say thank you to all the people who've already articulated the need for more granularity. Some of you know I work on sign languages, right? And the problem of how to sort of talk about heritage language acquisition more generally as applied to this shift in modality, right? This is the problem that never goes away. Masha knows about this. She's done some work on this, right? So like, do we think of deaf children who were born in the country which language they're learning as heritage? I mean, hearing children of deaf adults, CODAs, yes, perhaps, surely. But deaf children, maybe some get language exposure from super limited sources just at the right time. Some get later, right? Like how do we incorporate this difference in modality to this already expanding definition, right? And that's I call on you all who are thinking about this, particular Maria Carmen, right? Like how do you also say something concrete about, or at least partially concrete about, deaf kids or signing kids, right? Children with cochlear implants that are starting with sign or perhaps not starting with sign, but getting sign because parents wake up to the fact that they need to have sign language, right? But then the spoken language dominates, right? Are they heritage and how can we tell, right? Should we be looking at the later early phenomena, and which exactly phenomena should we be looking at in terms of sign acquisition as well as dominant language acquisition? I want to hear more about this discussion that's about to implode between Ianthi and Masha. Yeah, and finally, how do we incorporate this conversation into the larger ecologies, right? So I continue wanting you all to like, yes, migrants, yes, heritage, but also like, how do we cross modality and think about all the other kids who don't get enough attention? Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's take some more questions. Elena Sor.
Yes, hi everyone. And I'm very grateful to the organizers and the speakers. This is a great discussion. And my it's not a question, but a mere comment on the notion of accent, of heritage accent that Masha has put forward. I am like a naive listener, but also working on Romanian children as heritage speakers in France, and having recorded them, I noticed that there is a great variability in the strength of their accents. So some of them are just like very light, something that you can hear, but some of them have really, really strong accents. So this also points out to a continuum or to a spectrum of heritage accents. I think this is a very promising path of research, and also that we need to follow this. But I wanted to point out that also connecting with the other talks today, there is such a great diversity in heritage profiles that sometimes we feel like a bit, I feel the need to have boundaries or ways of distinguishing at which point someone that has a heritage accent is perceived on a spectrum more than only identified as a heritage speaker. But there's also this variability that we have to take into account, I think. Thank you very much.
Okay. Madhusmita?
Hi, thank you. All the three talks today were really great because I think they served as a very timely reminder of why it is important to discuss about who a heritage speaker is and how the definition is so problematic, because one scale doesn't fit all, as we know. So I really enjoyed listening to all of these presentations. My thoughts and observations are mostly about one very particular context, which is India, where I also work on. So when you are faced with a context which is naturally multilingual, as in, every state has its own linguistic borders and the division is quite stark, but it's also a multicultural, multilingual community at large. But then you also have ways of defining one kind of bilingualism apart from another. So in the case of, for example, Tamil speakers in Delhi, where the two languages we're talking about belong to two different families, that is one factor that is at play. And the other is that the I don't know if this is relevant, but the geographical distance between them and things like that. So would that mean, I mean, these are just questions that I have. Would that mean that speakers growing up in this sort of a context, we need to consider different parameters by labeling them as one particular kind of bilingual speakers or so on? I really liked Maria del Carmen's presentation on how to have different kinds of parameters in the papers. I think that's a very helpful way to go about with things. We can describe different parts of the context before we go into the analysis. I think that is one way to go about it. But I'm also wondering what more can we do to concretize a definition of who is a heritage speaker in contexts like India, for example, which are by nature very pluralistic. So how does the definition play into that? That's just something I wanted to think about. And otherwise, I really enjoyed all the talks today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhusmita. So there's one more hand raised, Roberta.
Okay, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I have a billion questions, as you can imagine, but I would also like to continue exactly what Madhusmita and Elena have been saying, which is, okay, in concrete, there are two main ways. By the way, Susanne Albers had also sent a note to me saying exactly what you're saying. My perspective is you cannot force your definition, but you should be aware that different people use different definitions depending on what is theoretically important to them. So age of onset effects, language of use. So therefore, we need to mention all the building blocks for all definitions, etc. So my question is now, what can we compare with what? Because if we go really fine-grained following MCarme's list, it works very well, but in the end, we end up that we cannot compare anyone to anyone. The accent is very good, but it's also fine. But I was thinking, how do I measure how people perceive this? I mean, there are studies, you're saying it, but we need to do this for many different languages. So what can we do in practice? Can we just start saying, okay, let's establish a norm based on, for instance, the accent and the prosody? And starting from there, we say, okay, these people all fall into this category. And then we have to, of course, we have to explain everything. And we can compare, if we're looking at age of onset, we can look at all the people that have the same. So in a normal heritage paper, what do we need to say? And how are we allowed to do? So what are the proxies? What can we use in practice? Because this is all completely relevant and this is all completely important and early acquisition and everything that Ianthi said. But for me, like a practitioner, what do I do? This is my question to the experts here.
So maybe, I mean, since these questions have come up from more than one person here, maybe we can again go back to the speakers and ask them to, discuss them further and also to respond to each other's presentations, that would also be nice. So Ianthi or Masha.
Can I just say very, very briefly? I just want to say, well, these are all fascinating questions. And of course, I just wanted to say that even if you're looking just at heritage speakers, right? Even if, let's say you identify a group and you call them heritage speakers and they're different from other bilinguals, okay? Which is not very clear to me, but let's assume this is the case. There are studies that have been done in Europe on heritage speakers. And if you see the results from these with Tanya Kupish, for example, and, quite a few other people looking at combinations of a Romance language with the Germanic language and so on, you don't find the problematic morphosyntax that you find in studies from the US. All right. And I'm just saying, I'm just indirectly responding to Masha's thing about the morphosyntax, the early phenomena that actually seem to show a problem. You actually find a lot of variation, even among people who are heritage speakers. And it is not a consistent and persistent finding, that early phenomena are going to be affected. So I want to bring in this aspect, which I tell my students as well, that, there is a comparison. And I think Silvina, and perhaps in other papers too, it has been raised that the prestige or the support that comes to heritage languages from top down is actually something that is going to affect the performance of these people in different contexts. So definitely we need to situate the phenomenon within a particular context, and this is related to the comment on India as well that was raised. Because there are heritage speakers there, I mean, in the strict sense of the word. But the problem is that there you're looking at one or more heritage languages alongside other languages, alongside English as a school language. And so you're looking at multilingualism, and I'm not sure you can actually define the boundaries and where the influence comes from. All right, I mean, it's that, but also the usage of language, which is very much with code switching, and in fact quite dense code switching, in which case it raises other issues with regard to accent, for instance, right? I mean, what Masha was talking about. There is work, not a lot, but some work on prosodic changes in code switch versus non-code switched utterances by bilinguals, right? So you can see the two systems actually intrasententially being connected and affected in that way. So what I think, from my point of view, the variation, Roberta, that you're talking about is something that you find not only among a group that you call heritage speakers, you find it across second language learners, you find it, some people would say also among native speakers, right? I mean, you might find monolingual speakers, and there are approaches that say that certain parts of language are more open, let's say, to variation than others. And this is what I'm particularly interested in. And I'm just trying to find, what are these domains and why is cross-linguistic influence more evident in the bilinguals in these domains, and whether these are the same where you find variation in the monolingual speakers as well, to the extent that they exist, right?
Anyone else?
Can I follow up on that? This is
sure.
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. One of the things I wanted to point out is that we haven't talked about the history of the term heritage today, really, but I think in Europe it only started popping up in around 2010. And this is also, if you look at the Journal of Language Contact, when the first mention of heritage shows up, if you look at the articles that were published there. But of course, this doesn't mean that heritage speakers were not studied, right? They were just studied under bilingualism or language contact or whatever. So I think we have to think about what we are adding with the term heritage, and again, who is not a heritage speaker, and we are talking about all this variation. So my question for everybody is, are we actually replacing the term bilingualism by heritage, or asymmetric bilingualism by heritage? What are we doing? I'm just asking. This is a controversial question that I want to put forward to all of you, because I think it comes up sometimes in these tensions between different traditions, and I think we are talking about bringing them all together. So how do we do that? It's important, and that's why I was wondering what the note that Susanne Alvers sent, what did she say? Because she works from a contact perspective as well. So
that's actually an interesting question, because otherwise diaspora studies or migration studies, have been very prevalent in other fields, whether economics or labor studies. Maybe for linguistics, it's a new term. Maybe that came about because of pedagogical issues also. But UN definitely has recognized languages amongst one of the things that should be studied with in relation to migrants, right?
Yeah.
But that might be a new edition. I mean, that's something that we have been looking at recently. Yeah.
Definitely, but heritage is not always understood as a migrant You know, it's also the language you learn at home. So for someone who learns English at home, that's their heritage. For someone, you know, like, so it depends on the tradition as well. I was talking to Mufwene, and he said, well, in Africa, it's the language we learn at home. That's our heritage, right? And it doesn't mean that it's not the majority language of the society. So yeah, so that's what I'm saying, like how, yeah, I think we need to be clear on these issues as well.
Any other observations or comments? Masha, would you like to add something? Oh, I see another hand, but Natalia? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, it took me some time. Sorry, I'm just used to Zoom a little bit. I want also to go back to the question which was raised by Luciana about the cutoff point. You know, like I think, you know, like no one wants to abolish using the label heritage speakers, and we don't want to get rid of bilingualism. And I think, you know, like many of us is using heritage bilingualism. But I do want, you know, to talk a little bit about and Elena Soari also mentioned the continuum, because when we talk about the cutoff point, and many of us, and I'm also using when strictly defining the groups, heritage speakers as those who acquire the heritage language, home language, community language at home, and later on exposed to the societal language, and we take the cutoff point of 5. But I do point that, you know, like what are we doing with this with a group of people who start acquiring at the age of 6, 7, and I think maybe grouping grouping immigrant or heritage speakers into groups, maybe looking into continuum is something that we can start doing, and not looking just on a very strict group, the age of 5 and 6 as a strict point, and leaving aside this 1.5 generation, because I think we also need to look into this generation when they start, and looking what Ianthi was saying about different phenomena, early acquired, late acquired phenomena, looking into the phonetics and phonology, morphosyntax, and trying to understand whether we find, and we do find, because we had a couple of studies of that kind where we split them into groups, not a continuum, but looking into the group who acquired they started acquiring the societal language and the sociolinguistic, what you would call a generation and a half. So I think and the field is going in that direction, kind of not a binary monolingual, bilingual, or heritage or non-heritage speakers, but looking more into continuum and presenting measures, indices of different types on the scale, rather than trying to group them. So that's kind of my point.
Okay. Thank you. So we have to wrap up soon. So I'll ask the speakers again to come back and respond and give a final remark on the discussion here. So Masha, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief because I think we're over time, but I wanted to go back to the issue of what do we do practically. I think that came up several times. Roberta asked that, but several other people. Like there are all these very different conditions, and I want to say just 2 things because I don't want to multiply entities. One is it's very, very helpful to combine the study of perception, the study of production together with the study of comprehension. That's where we often find that one and the same person patterns differently. It's hard to do everything, but the more we can do, we can approach the same phenomenon, let's say, use of clitics in heritage Italian, both on the production and comprehension scale, the more we will learn. And the second thing is, these days it's becoming much easier to do very complex statistics. And if we integrate more of the phenomena that people brought up today, I think we could start seeing patterns. And I don't think we'll go away from the continuum, but we will see that some things are not random. there are still groupings and there are patterns in what we observe. So I'll stop there and again thank the organizers for creating such a rich discussion. There's way more we can all say, but I want to assure I don't hear just my own voice.
Okay, Ianthi?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say that I also agree with the continuum idea. Obviously, the reason why I mentioned 5 or 6 is because it's fundamental. When schooling starts, a lot of different input starts. And it's not just the modality, the written language. It's also the type of language that's used, the genre that you use in school language that has a lot of effects, let's say, on the child's consolidation of the language, either the heritage language or the new language they're learning. So that's the reason why I mentioned 5 or 6, because that's the time when another type of input comes in. But I'm all in favor of looking at practically at different phenomena in production and comprehension, taking into account, however, whether in what we know from monolingual development, whether clitics, for instance, in that language are very early or not, because that's really important. When you're looking at French, for example, and when you're looking at Spanish or Italian, you do find a difference there. So when you consider heritage speakers, I think the timing of the phenomenon in the language, where you can look at monolingual children developing that language, might actually be useful in your classification.
Maria Carmen, one final remark.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I'll just say that I think it became very evident through this conversation that we need to bring theories and results from the disciplines of heritage languages, bilingualism, and language contact closer together. It's already happening, but we still could learn a lot from each other. And just another final point is that I think with heritage research, we pay a lot of attention to the heritage language and not so much to the majority language. And we've done some research where we actually observed a lot of variation in the majority language as well. So this, again, relates to the point of taking into account the bilingual repertoire, the multilingual repertoire, and not just one of the languages in isolation of the repertoire of that speaker.
Okay, so we have
can I add to that real quick?
Yeah,
sorry,
sure.
because I think Maria Carmen said something very important. We have been less attentive to the language of input, what we call the baseline, and I think we're starting to learn to look at what these people hear, and it often means that you take a 20-year-old speaker and you look at the speech of the 40-year-old who is their input at home, or their 60-year-old. So we often see that heritage speakers are more conservative because they repeat what their grandmother said. So I think that's very important, and there's more and more work which shows that some of the changes we see in heritage languages are already present in the input they hear. And we miss them if we just look at the language of the homeland or focus on the standard language. So I think that's a very promising direction of research.
Right. Roberto, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to close down and to say, yes, please, thank you. Variation. I see a lot of studies also that attribute to change and heritage stuff that is already there in the input. So, Ianthi, thank you, and thank you, everybody. Syntactic microvariation is serious stuff. So we need to take it very seriously and look at the language of the input very seriously. So I'm so happy that it came out also at the highlight at the end. But, I just wanted to actually close everything. But Pritha, you finish, and I just wanted to give some final announcements, but I'm done with this comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say this was really a brainstorming session. I said it's going to be a difficult question, but I guess it turned out to be much more difficult, and of course interesting, because the more difficult a question is, the more unanswered questions we have, the better for us. And it means that we'll come back and engage with this question further. So over to you, Roberta. You wanted to say something, announce something?
Yeah, just thank you so much for saying yes to this crazy brainstorming. We do many of these. We're at our 5th now. It is very informal, but it's so inspiring and important to hear people discuss things that, you know, if you sit at your home thinking of problems, then you say, I don't know how to solve it, and I'm the only one who doesn't know. But, you know, if these big shots and these important people in the field also are thinking about it, then this means we're not doing it wrong. It is just genuinely difficult. We're going to have more heritage language meetings. Please send your abstracts to the Heritage Language Conference so we can meet again and talk again. Or if I'm there, I don't know, but, you know, whoever is there. But also, one thing I wanted to say, actually, indeed, we have the platform. There are a lot of new people. If you want to join the discussion, the mailing list, the platform itself, it is really completely informal. As long as you work on syntax, because this was born for syntax, but not just on syntax. Just drop us a line there and join us. And I hope to see many of you more around. But thank you so much, Ianthi, MariCarme, and Masha. This was really fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.